Wa versus ga. What's the difference? Have you ever wondered what the difference is between wa and ga in Japanese? Do you find it very difficult to understand when to use wa and when to use ga? Don't worry if you don't know the difference between the two particles. You're not alone. Even native speakers often find it hard to explain because we natives use them unconsciously. In this video, we'll learn the basics of how to use wa and ga, the function of wa, topic and contrast. The particle wa is used to show what the sentence is about, the topic. For example, 私は学生です。I am a student. Here, 私は means 私, I is the topic of this sentence. So it's like, as for me, I am a student. In this sentence, the speaker uses wa to point out the topic, 私, I. Wa is also used to express contrast. For example, 日本語は話せます。でも、英語は話せません。I can speak Japanese, but I can't speak English. In this sentence, wa compares Japanese and English. In this sentence, the particle wa indicates a contrast between the two languages, Japanese and English. The function of ga, description and focus. Ga is often used to describe something. For example, 猫が机の上にいます。A cat is on the desk. Ga in this sentence shows that 猫, cat, is described by the following words. No contrast, no emphasis, just describing what exists or is happening. By using ga, the speaker describes the cat and the sentence. The speaker tells the listener what is happening. It's neutral and informative, like a narrator describing a scene. The particle ga can also highlight something like choosing one from a group. For example, 動物の中で鹿が一番好きです。Among animals, I like deer the best. The particle ga gives focus to the deer. With ga, the speaker shines the spotlight on the deer and not on other animals. New and old information. There is another use. In Japanese conversation, the particle ga is often used to present new information. On the other hand, the particle wa is often used to indicate old or already known information as a topic. For example, 私には妹がいます。妹は教師です。I have a younger sister. The younger sister is a teacher. In the former sentence, 妹 appears as new information, and the latter sentence, on the other hand, imoto appears as old, already known information. Summary. Let's review. Wa is used to express topic, contrast, or old information. Ga is used to express description, focus, or new information. In real Japanese, the choice depends on the context. These are just core patterns, and they work well for many situations. But remember, Japanese is a real language, not just a formula. In actual conversations, wa and ga are used in many different and subtle ways. I relied on these references in making my video, but this video is a simplified introduction. I've tried to make it beginner-friendly, but the full picture is more complex. If you have any questions after watching the video, let me know in the comments. I'd like to hear your experience, and I may include your questions in a future video. Thank you for watching.